Okay, my name is Juliet Mahon. I'm from the University of Limerick in Ireland, and this is my colleague Lorraine, Ryan, and there's a wider team. So the title of our presentation, as you can see, is Zero Hours Regulation, and I suppose it's really what we're doing here is a cautionary tale of a country that actually did regulate for 0 hours, and whether that succeeded or not is the focus of our presentation, and the intersectionality between the regulation or the effects of that regulation and other aspects of the Irish system and the overall effect that had. So just very briefly, the background: we were commissioned by the government in Ireland to do a study on 0 hours work in Ireland, mainly on foot of a concern about the emergence of 0 hours contracts in the UK, and rumblings in Ireland that such work was being utilised by employers, but there wasn't much data on it. So we were commissioned to investigate and to look into this and to a wider report on the overall extent of 0 hours and its effects on workers. Just to methodology very quickly, we interviewed anyone that was involved with workers' advocacy or representing workers, so migrant rights associations, advocacy groups for young people, advocacy groups for women, trade union representatives, government departments, employer organisations, and various sectoral representatives across Ireland. So just to give you some very brief context on Ireland, Ireland is a country that in recent years has moved what we might call from an atypical market economy, where we had a high level of social partnership and trade unions at the table in collective bargaining at national level. But since the recession, obviously, the social partnership model has collapsed, and we're moving towards a very, I suppose, what we might call a pure liberal market economy. Now, when we started the research, it was interesting to learn from various researchers in the UK and legal experts in the UK and in other countries that Ireland is seen as an early and proactive regulator of 0 hours. And the kind of backstory to that is also interesting and informative, because 0 hours regulation was introduced in Ireland in 1997 at a time when unions were very strong, in the sense that they were involved in social partnership. Social partnership was coming to an end. And the government wanted to renew it because this form of partnership was seen actually as instrumental in Ireland's economic success at the time. So they were very keen that the unions would get involved. And the unions insisted that as part of that social partnership, re-entering that there would be regulation introduced to curb 0 hours contracts. And so it was introduced as part of legislation that Ireland had to introduce in terms of working hours from a directive at EU level. So what was introduced was legislation, a section of the Organisation of Working Time Act, which provided compensation for those employed on 0 hours contracts, whereby if people were to be available for work but the work wasn't available for them, they would get 25% of their expected hours or 15 hours compensation, whichever was the lesser. So far, so good. Was the legislation effective? Well, we would say no. And because it's coming up to Halloween, I've got this little man here, so for us it's very apt, because the devil is in the detail with this particular piece of legislation. Now, this is quite an involved overhead here, but what this section of the Organisation of Working Time Act tells us is that people who are covered by this section in Ireland have to be an employee with a contract of employment. And this is a big thing in Ireland. In Ireland, we have a binary system of employment status. You're either an employee and you have rights, or you're not an employee and you have no rights. We don't have an intermediate category of worker such as they have in the UK. So various court decisions in Ireland found that people who were not deemed to be employees had absolutely no protection under the Organisation of Working Time Act provision for 0 hours. And this was all based on this idea of mutuality. So if they could find a contract where there was a mutual obligation on the part of the employer to provide work and the employee to turn up, then that person would be an employee, they would be covered by the Act. However, the Act specifically excludes work of a casual nature. And thus we found that across the country, employers who had cottoned onto this were putting clauses into contracts where this was very specifically stated. Although employee or workers weren't always aware of this, and some of these workers would be working up to 35 hours a week, but they weren't on they weren't employees. And when issues arose, then they found that they had no rights. So what did we find in Ireland? Well, we found when we spoke to employers' organisations, they said to us, well, why would we use 0 hours contracts as covered by the Working Time Act when we can use casual contracts instead? So we don't use them. What we found were on-call contracts where people would be called in on a casual basis. We also found evidence of hybrid contracts where people were given employment contracts but for very low hours, and the rest of their contract would be casual. So what we actually say is that not only did the organisation of working time provision for 0 hours contracts not work, it actually exacerbated the use of casual, on-call, precarious work in Ireland. And some of the direct effects of this that we noted from our study would be very similar to the work on precarious contracts around Europe and other parts of the world, but just some specifics for Ireland. So obviously low wages, because people employed on these type of contracts, they tend to be in low wage sectors anyway, but this had the effect of pushing down wages. And if you have to combine this with looking at Ireland. In Ireland at the moment we have a rent crisis. In Dublin you can expect to pay over €2,000 a month in rent, and there's very little rent assistance. And that is a problem for people on low wages. Childcare in Ireland is recognised as one of the most expensive in the OECD, so an average childcare per month would be €745 with no subsidies. The other issue was unpredictability. In Ireland, again, if you want to rent a house, if you want to buy a house, if you want to get childcare, you would not have access to that kind of stuff if your work isn't predictable. Landlords and childcare facilities simply will not entertain you. And things like access to finance, getting loans, etc., is problematic. And basic family considerations that we associate with citizenship, such as starting a family, etc., are becoming out of the reach of people on low wages. Another issue is the tax return. So, the lower the wages, people fall out of the tax bracket, the revenue to the state is lessened, and thus the government doesn't have as much money to spend on state supports, and that becomes a problem as well. But what we're really interested in is the intersectionality between this legislation, which actually moved people into casual work, and some other aspects of the Irish system. So the areas we're looking at, and I'll be as quick as I can, 0 hours legislation or lack of it, and employers' rational decision making, also worker rational decisions, social welfare provisions, and conditionality. And there's some resonance in Jill's presentation here. So workers' rational decision making in Ireland. In Ireland, there is in-work benefits available to workers. They can claim welfare if they're working 3 days over 7. But if they go over those 3 days, even an hour or two, they will lose their benefits. And since the Troika in Ireland and since the recession, access to social welfare has become extremely difficult to access and extremely conditional. And so there's a huge risk for workers, if they take on extra work, that they will lose all the ancillary benefits such as fuel allowances, medical cards, etc., that they do have access to in Ireland. So there is that incentive to stay in low hours work. There's also a family income supplement where workers, on a kind of conversely, will work over 19 hours, but they have to earn less than a certain amount, and they have to have one child. But if their hours are cut, they lose that family income supplement. So the representatives of workers in these, and of course it's invariably migrants, women, younger workers, etc., it was seen as a perverse kind of poverty trap. And I'll come back to how employers use that in a minute. The other thing in Ireland is and a colleague of ours, in Maynooth, Mary Murphy, has written a lot about this, conditionality of welfare payments in Ireland. It has become much tighter since the recession. So people do feel compelled to take jobs in poor quality jobs or 0 hours jobs. So what has happened is this intersection, in a sense, has embedded low hours, casual, 0 hours type work in the Irish context. Employers' rational decision making. Yeah, the response from the leading employers group in Ireland, IBEC, as I said already, was, well, why would we use 0 hours contracts where we have to pay people and give them an employment contract? It doesn't make sense. We just give them casual work instead. And in fact, we found a lot of evidence where there was sites which would draft these type of contracts for employers. And of course, we also have to remember the state as employer. Again, because of the Troika and because of the pressures put on the Irish state, a lot of services were outsourced. And of course now when tenders are going in for contracts in the area of care work, community care, the indicators are that they're awarded on a low-cost basis. Who can provide those low-cost services? People who employ people on casual contracts. We're not immune to it. A lot of lecturers in the University of Limerick are working on 0 hours contracts. So the government are employing people directly themselves on the 0 hour, and teachers. And we're losing all our young teachers. They're all going off to the Middle East where they can earn a lot more money for a lot better conditions. The intersection with social insurance. In Ireland, all employers have to pay social insurance. However, during the crisis, the government reduced social insurance for employers that were employing people on low pay. They halved it. And what this incentivized employers to do, and they were very open with us about it, was they would split jobs. So where before they would have given person a job, they were now giving somebody a very low hours contract. The rest would be casual, as and when we need you. And they would be splitting jobs between people, and so and this became embedded. Now there has been changes back. The social insurance has gone back up slightly, but that kind of acceptance of these low quality, low hours, 0 hours jobs has been accepted and embedded in the Irish context. And another thing that came up quite a lot with trade unions and advocacy groups was that there was evidence, and I will say it was anecdotal, that employers would use this intersection with social welfare. They knew employees didn't want to risk losing benefits, so they would facilitate them. But if an employee raised a grievance or caused trouble or actually refused a job, even though they contractually were entitled to do so on a given day, they would then have their hours changed so that they would lose their benefits the next week, or they wouldn't be taken back on. And this was highlighted as a big problem, and there certainly was evidence when there was a strike on one of the biggest indigenous retailers in Ireland, and those people that went out on the picket line found that their hours were being manipulated and changed around so that they were not getting their access to welfare. So you mightn't recognise these. One is a tomato and one is a tomato, okay? So the idea is legislative responses in Ireland, has anything really changed? So the government on foot of, there was a lot of controversy over the report when it came out. And the government, of course, the government fell. So the Labour element of the government bombed in the next election, and a Fine Gael, which would be a centre-right government, was elected with support from another centre-right party. But they did all say as part of their election campaigns that they would deal with the 0 hours issue. So these are just some of the examples of, here we go, of legislation. And again, it's very wordy and it's quite small. But basically the Labour Party, who are now out of power, proposed legislation that very much tied in with some of the recommendations that we see in the UK, that people after a certain period of time that might have a legitimate expectation where they're actually working hours regularly should be given a contract of employment. There would be clear indications of the types of contracts that people were signing and written information on that, because that is an issue in Ireland. Another party, Sinn Féin, would be considered a Republican party, more or less the same. I'm on my second last overhead. They made it even more stringent, that employers would be almost an element of illegality in not giving people or making people employees, and employers would have to pass an objective justification test to get around that. In Ireland, case law will show us that objective justification has actually been a high hurdle for employers to surmount. But the government introduced a bill whereby 0 hours would be banned, except in cases of genuinely casual work, or where they're essential to cover emergency or short-term cover situations. Guess which one the government adopted? And it's now going through our Parliament, our Dáil, with a view to being enacted at the end of this year, which is why I was saying, is it a tomato or is it a tomato? It's the same bloody thing that we had before, in our opinion. But they're good on the rhetoric. So we see all over Ireland, Minister says 0 hours contracts to be all but prohibited. Minister announces new 0 hours legislation. So I suppose it's a bit disappointing for us that this has happened, but this looks like this is what's coming down the tracks, more of the same. So our conclusion: the 1997 Act actually didn't help workers in precarious situations. It actually made it worse. And I suppose this gives credibility to writers mainly from the UK, such as Jeff Kenner and Jeremiah Prassel and Keith Ewing and etc., who said that the legislation, if you tinker with legislation without thinking about the wider context for short-term kind of expediency, it's not going to work. But another issue that we have to consider is that if we go back to the issue of social welfare, and you raised this, Jill, what we see in Ireland now, because of the social welfare system and people being trapped in these jobs, is that our state is funding zero or low, is funding this kind of work, and the responsibility for providing decent wages is falling back on our government and not on employers who are in a sense being subvented. And is that right? And of course that's a bigger question. And the other thing is that the risk for fluctuations has been passed totally onto workers in the Irish context in a lot of situations. So, it's a problematic situation. The current proposed legislation is untested, but we find it's problematic. So our conclusion is, is there going to be any change? We don't think so. What is the answer? We would say that the only time that positive changes have happened for workers in Ireland is when there's strong collective bargaining, when unions are strong. But I'd say we're very dubious that anything is going to happen, especially because we have a bigger problem coming down the tracks with Brexit and etc. And the government isn't going to touch anything that is going to weaken, in their perception, our competitiveness. So that's it, basically. It's a very specific case study.